mythic birth of Rome. Every great story needs a beginning, and Rome chose to be born wrapped in myth. This was no ordinary founding tale, but a narrative woven from blood, divine will, and boundless ambition. At its heart stand two brothers, Romulus and Remus, whose lives blur the mist of legend and the contours of a deeper truth, that a people needed to believe their destiny was sealed from the start by divine intervention. They say Rhea Silvia, daughter of King Numitor, was forced to become a Vestal virgin to prevent her from bearing children. Yet Mars himself intervened, or so the ancients claimed, and she conceived twins. Viewed as a threat by the usurper Amulius, they were sentenced to death. Instead, they were cast into the Tiber River, only for its current to deliver them gently to shore. There, a she-wolf discovered them and nursed them, an act of salvation as symbolic as it was improbable. Soon after, a shepherd named Faustulus rescued and raised them in the humble countryside, unaware that these boys carried within them the seed of an empire. Their story is more than a simple moral fable. It carries something deeper, darker. For it was not reconciliation that defined their coming of age, but conflict. After overthrowing Amulius and restoring their grandfather to the throne, they refused to return home. They set out to found a city of their own. And here comes the act that would define Rome above all else: fratricide. Romulus and Remus quarreled over who would lend his name to the new city. They sought omens, studied the skies, interpreted bird flights. But ambition pays no heed to signs. In a moment of fury, Romulus killed his brother with his own hands. To found Rome, it seemed, required sacrifice. From that instant, the city bore his name. Romulus became its first king, and Rome bore that first stain of blood, as though power itself were never meant to be clean. Much of what we know of this era reaches us through writers like Livy and Plutarch, who penned their accounts centuries later. Yet the Romans never disavowed this myth. Instead, they embraced it proudly. To them, it was not a tale of shame, but a testament to the relentless harshness of fate. Rome was born not of consensus, peace, or happy union, but of conflict, crime, and duty to a higher cause. This very logic would echo through the centuries to come. The narrative does not end with Remus's murder. From that moment, Rome begins to take shape as a real, tangible city. Romulus organizes its structure, divides it into tribes, establishes the first governing bodies, appoints senators, elderly, wise advisors, and forms a rudimentary military force, knowing that a city without defense cannot endure. Yet one essential element remained missing: people. To populate Rome, Romulus threw open its gates to criminals, escaped slaves, exiles, anyone without land or law. Rome began as a refuge for society's outcasts. These early citizens shared no common identity, no unified culture or bloodline. But they did share something far more important to Romulus: the will to start anew. This brutal, chaotic blend would become one of Rome's hidden strengths. A city without a single origin, yet united by a purpose that steadily revealed itself. With a predominantly male, aggressive populace, the next problem was inevitable: there were no women. Thus unfolds one of the most controversial episodes in Rome's origin story: the rape of the Sabine women. Romulus staged grand games to lure neighboring tribes under the guise of celebration. In the midst of the festivities, the Romans seized the Sabine women and abducted them en masse. This was no conquest of love, but a wholesale kidnapping. War erupted with the Sabines, yet the very women they had taken, now wives and mothers, intervened to halt the bloodshed. From this forced alliance sprang a new social fabric, as Rome began to absorb what it lacked without asking permission. To modernize, this episode is an indelible stain. But for the Romans, it embodied another foundational lesson: cunning, opportunism, and the integration of foes into the Roman vision. It wasn't about excusing violence, but understanding it as part of the process. For Rome, growth would always demand a price. After Romulus's reign, said to have lasted 37 years, 6 more kings followed. Some remained shadowy figures, others left enduring marks on the city's organization. Numa Pompilius, for instance, is celebrated for his wisdom and for establishing many of the religious institutions that shaped Roman life. If Romulus was the warrior king, Numa was the lawmaker who brought order after violence. Next came Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, alternating war with urban expansion. Then the Etruscan kings arrived: Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and finally Tarquinius Superbus. Under them, Rome transformed into a city of stone. Its first sewers built, the forum defined, religious and political rituals solidified. No longer a fortified village, Rome now aspired to greatness. But with the Etruscans came a harsher, more authoritarian monarchy. Tarquinius Superbus ruled without Senate council, silenced dissent, and his son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed the heinous act that sparked the final change: the rape of Lucretia. That tragedy ignited a revolt that toppled the monarchy. Yet it was more than the end of a king. It marked the close of an entire era. Rome renounced absolute rule, at least in theory, and embarked on an unprecedented experiment: the Republic. Still, everything that followed, the Senate, the consuls, the wars, the conquests, the emperors, would bear the imprint of this beginning. A beginning rooted in myth, yet built on decisive acts, evolving institutions, and a worldview in which Rome's fate seemed sealed even before the city existed. Because this is the most fascinating aspect of Rome's origin. It doesn't matter whether the she-wolf truly existed, whether Romulus was real, or whether the omens were genuine. What matters is that Rome believed in them, and in that belief, it forged an identity that endured long after its fall. The idea of Rome as a predestined entity, greater than the sum of its parts, was born with those twins abandoned on the Tiber's bank. From that very first moment, its shadow began to stretch across the world. The fall of the monarchy and the birth of the Republic. Rome did not begin as a republic. Liberty, the value so celebrated in Roman history, was an achievement, not a starting point. For more than 2 centuries, the city was ruled by kings, some revered as wise founders of institutions, others reviled for their tyranny and disdain for tradition. This system initially seemed necessary for a young city still weak before its neighbors and lacking the structures for collective rule. Yet over time, absolute power became intolerable. And when that power was embodied by a man like Tarquin the Proud, change became inevitable. Tarquin ascended the throne through violence, not by the choice of the people or the Senate, but by usurping his father-in-law, Servius Tullius, whom he murdered in cold blood. That stain would never be forgotten. From his first day as king, Tarquin ruled as if Rome were his property and existing institutions mere obstacles. He abolished the Council of Elders, scorned dissenting voices, and filled the city with grand monuments built on forced labor, among them the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and the monumental sewer system that still functions today. What made his rule truly unbearable was not only his cruelty, but his complete disregard for any limit. He governed with arrogance, backed by a small circle of loyalists and the terror he inspired. His enemies vanished, his opponents were exiled, and the people's pleas were ignored. Rome, a refuge for outcasts and free warriors, found itself at the mercy of a dynasty that acted with divine impunity but lacked divine wisdom. The spark of revolt was not a decree or a tax, but a private tragedy turned political symbol. Sextus Tarquin, the king's son, visited the home of a noble named Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus and became obsessed with his wife, Lucretia. Seeing her as a trophy to prove his power, he crept into her chamber one dark night, threatened her, and violated her honor. Lucretia's response was shattering. She summoned her husband, her father, and leading citizens of Rome. She revealed the crime and, seeing no hope for justice under a system that placed the powerful above the law, took her own life. Her body, displayed before Rome's leaders, was more than a corpse. It was a declaration. It proved that the city could endure no longer under the Tarquin's yoke. From that moment, the Republic was born. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, Lucretia's kinsman and one of those present, an uprising swept through the city. Brutus, though of an ancient family, had been seen as politically indifferent. Yet in the face of injustice and grief, he emerged as the leader Rome needed. He rallied the people, denounced the crimes of king and son, and swore that never again would a single man wield absolute power in Rome. The Tarquins were expelled. Tarquin the Proud made several attempts to reclaim the throne, first with inside allies, then with support from the king of nearby Colosseum. But each effort failed. The Romans had crossed a point of no return. The monarchy was overthrown not by careful reform, but by desperate reaction to excess. Freedom arrived through indignation, not design. In place of the king, Rome adopted a radically different system. 2 annually elected consuls who shared power and kept each other in check. Each could veto the other's decisions, creating a fragile but deliberate balance. The Senate, composed of the heads of the most influential families, gained prominence as an advisory body. Though not democratic by modern standards, this new regime was a genuine attempt to distribute authority and subject it to collective oversight. Yet the Republic was not perfect from the start. The patricians, the aristocratic class, controlled all high offices. The plebeians, the rest of the population, were excluded from politics and the judiciary. This inequality generated tensions that would define the early decades of the new system. The struggle between patricians and plebeians was central to Rome's political evolution, forging institutions that gradually expanded civic participation. In this context, Brutus became a living legend. As one of the first consuls, he faced the ultimate test when his own sons joined a plot to restore the Tarquins. Without hesitation, he condemned them and allowed their execution. Rome could afford no exceptions. Law must stand above personal ties. This harsh but emblematic act was celebrated as a demonstration of civic virtue, setting a model many would try, though few would match. Over the years, the Republic solidified its institutions. Magistracies for specific tasks, codified laws, appeals mechanisms, and, in extreme crisis, the appointment of a dictator for a limited term. Each innovation aimed to prevent power from sliding back into tyranny, and to ensure that no individual, however brilliant or popular, could repeat Tarquin's abuse. Remarkably, the Romans did not destroy all that came before. Many monarchical structures were adapted. Religious rituals endured under magisterial oversight. Military practices evolved, retaining their spirit. Rome did not reject its past but channeled it into a new form of governance, building on the ruins of what had come before. That transformation, sparked by Lucretia's tragedy, Brutus's resolve, and the collective will to reject despotism, marked the beginning of one of Rome's most complex and fascinating eras. For nearly 5 centuries, the Republic would guide its expansion, internal conflicts, betrayals, and greatest achievements. But even this more just system faced dangers, for the true enemy of the Republic was not power itself, but the temptation to cling to it beyond the law's limits. What follows is the story of that constant tension between personal ambition and collective will. And though Rome would reinvent itself many times, the echo of that first revolt against absolute power would resonate through every crisis, every coup, every attempt to redefine what it truly means to govern without kings. The first enemies of Rome. Rome was not born surrounded by empires, but by tribes. Its first expansion did not face professional armies or great civilizations, but nearby peoples with a history as ancient as its own and an unbreakable will to defend their independence. In that opening chapter of military conflicts, what was at stake was not an empire or control of the Mediterranean, but the simple survival of a city that had not yet discovered its destiny, yet was already showing an insatiable ambition. The map of Latium in Rome's early centuries was a tangle of small communities, fortified villages, and medium-sized cities, each with its own traditions, languages, and rivalries. The Latins, Sabines, Volsci, Equi, Hernici, the Etruscans to the north, and the Samnites farther south formed a mosaic of intersecting interests where alliances lasted only as long as the wind. In that context, Rome did not seem very different from the rest. But while many of those cities merely defended their land and customs, Rome operated with a different logic. Every conflict, every treaty, every truce was an opportunity to take a step forward, to strengthen its position, to grow. In the early years of the Republic, Rome was still fragile. It had lost its king, who once held unified military command, and now depended on consuls who changed every year, leading armies of citizens who traded their plows for spears for only a few weeks each campaign season. Their enemies, however, showed no mercy. The Etruscans to the north remained a concrete threat, especially the city of Veii, which directly rivaled Rome for control of the Tiber Valley. The wars against Veii became a symbol of Roman obstinacy. For nearly 4 centuries there were skirmishes, broken treaties, offensives, and retreats, until finally Rome captured and utterly destroyed the city. That victory marked a turning point, not only because it eliminated an age-old rival, but because it proved Rome would sustain a conflict for generations if it meant securing its survival and expansion. But the Etruscan front was not the only one. Farther east, the Volsci and Equi continuously harassed Roman territory. These warlike tribes, organized into tribal communities, used their mobility to strike swiftly and vanish into the forests and mountains. To counter them, Rome had to adapt its way of waging war. It learned to build fortresses on enemy soil, to keep troops in the field for longer campaigns, and to establish colonies of veterans to secure newly conquered regions. Each foe left a lesson, and Rome was not a city that forgot. In these early wars, the office of consul proved insufficient in times of crisis. Thus, a new institution was created, the dictatorship. An extraordinary magistrate, chosen for a limited time, vested with full powers to face a specific threat. Contrary to what later generations might have imagined, this figure carried no stigma of tyranny, but the honor of duty. It was the Republic's answer to the unexpected, and often, it was the key to survival. Wars against the Sabines and Hernici, by contrast, were marked by proximity and a long history of cultural mingling. The Sabines, who, according to tradition, had been integrated since the time of Romulus, remained a distinct people, not always ready to abide by decisions made in the Roman Forum. The process of Romanization in these regions was neither immediate nor peaceful. Over time, however, marriage alliances, commercial agreements, and military pressure dissolved many of those differences. Yet if there was one enemy who truly challenged Rome in this stage, it was the Samnite people. Organized in tribal leagues, proud of their independence, masters of mountain warfare, and intimately familiar with the terrain, the Samnites offered fierce resistance. The Samnite Wars were a long, tense cycle filled with reversals. More than once, the Romans suffered humiliating defeats, the most famous being the Caudine Forks, where an entire Roman army was forced to march unarmed beneath a row of spears as a symbol of submission. For a city built on honor, it was a deep wound. But rather than break Rome, the defeat ignited its spirit of vengeance. Time and again, Rome returned, this time with more soldiers, better generals, and a will that bordered on obsession. The struggle with the Samnites taught Rome a lesson it applied to every future enemy. Winning battles was not enough. It had to ensure the vanquished could never rise again. Thus, after each victory came a new colony, A road, an unequal treaty. Conquered peoples could keep their lands but not their laws. They could maintain their customs, but not their sovereignty. Rome wove a web of coerced alliances, a political military spider's web that expanded with each conflict. What began as a defensive war ended up as indirect expansion. In this framework, colonies were a key tool. They were not mere military outposts, but fully fledged cities designed to replicate Roman life in newly subdued territories. Citizens, either with full or limited rights, were sent there. Temples, forums, and walls were built. Land was parceled out to the new colonists. Colonies ensured loyalty along the frontiers and served as nuclei of Romanization. Wherever a colony was planted, Rome arrived. At the same time, Rome began perfecting its army. What had once been a citizen militia evolved into a disciplined force with an increasingly professional structure. Legions emerged as the central unit, with cohorts, centuries, and hierarchical commands. Training became constant, weapons were standardized, and most importantly, the army became a space in which citizens forged their identity. Going to war was not just a duty, it was a way of being Roman. As the city grew and its immediate enemies were defeated, Rome ceased to be a rural community and became a regional power. It was no longer about defending fields, but about securing control over trade routes, natural resources, and strategic positions. War ceased to be a reaction and became a habit, a means to ensure internal stability, channel social tensions, and bolster the prestige of the political elite. Military victories began to reverberate in domestic politics. Successful generals gained prestige, soldiers expected rewards, and the Senate calculated expansion with cold precision rather than fear. War was institutionalized, woven into the normal functioning of the state. Meanwhile, neighboring peoples realized that resisting Rome was increasingly pointless, that opposing her was no longer a struggle between equals, but a battle against an ever-rising tide. What now seems inevitable in hindsight was fraught with uncertainty at the time. Nothing guaranteed that Rome would triumph over the Samnites or subdue the Etruscans. Every victory was won through effort, loss, and treaties that sometimes betrayed solemnly proclaimed principles in the Forum. But the outcome was clear. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had already become the dominant force on the Italian peninsula, and it had done so by facing its neighbors one by one, learning from each fight, integrating the defeated, and forging a system of power that, though imperfect, operated with an efficiency few could match. Rome's first enemies were not distant empires nor exotic powers, but her neighbors, people with familiar faces, related languages, and similar gods. Yet it was this very struggle among kindred peoples that made Rome grow so swiftly. Every victory broadened its horizon. Every conquered border revealed another to cross. And thus, almost without fully intending it, Rome ceased to be one city among many and became the power that would soon look beyond the sea. Religion and power in ancient Rome. In the Roman world, religion was never a separate sphere from politics or daily decisions. There was no clear line between the divine and the human, because every act, even the most mundane, was imbued with the presence of the gods. In Rome, religion wasn't a private refuge of the soul or a matter of personal belief, but a public system of practices, rituals, and obligations designed to keep the balance between mortals and the invisible forces that shaped their destiny. Everything was regulated. Everything had a prescribed form, and everything was performed with the deep conviction that the city's success or failure ultimately depended on correctly following the will of the gods. This worldview began to take shape in the earliest days of the city. Even Romulus, Rome's mythical founder, is said to have consulted the flight of birds before laying out the walls. That tradition, reading heavenly signs to guide earthly decisions, quickly became institutionalized. The augurs were charged with interpreting divine will through natural omens, the flight patterns of birds, a bolt of thunder at just the right moment, an animal's unexpected appearance. It wasn't empty superstition, it was a language. And in Rome, that language carried real political weight. Every magistrate had to consult the auspices before taking office. No law was passed without the proper sacrifices. Generals, before marching off to war, offered prayers at the temples to secure divine approval. In times of crisis, be it a prolonged drought, an epidemic, or an unforeseen defeat, the Senate could decree extraordinary rites, collective fasts, or even import foreign cults to appease an angry deity. This was not mere fervor, but responsibility. The Romans organized their religion as a meticulous machine, and every ritual had to be executed correctly, precisely, without error. The term they used was pax deorum, peace with the gods. Maintaining that peace was a state priority. At the heart of this harmony stood the College of Pontiffs, the priests who oversaw the religious calendar, public rituals, and the interpretation of sacred law. The Pontifex Maximus was indeed one of the most powerful figures in Rome, not through military command, but through control over what could or could not be done under the gaze of the gods. Remarkably, these priesthoods were held by the same aristocrats who governed the Republic. To be a pontiff, augur, or flamen was entirely compatible with serving as senator, consul, or general. In fact, it was part of the same fabric. Political and religious power were two sides of the same coin. In the very center of Rome lay the Forum, the hub of political and social life, and just a few steps away stood the Temple of Vesta, where the Vestal Virgins tended the sacred flame that must never die. Chosen as young girls from patrician families, these women dedicated 30 years to religious service, remaining aloof from marriage and the outside world. Their chastity was not a moral ideal, but a magical condition. If a Vestal broke her vow, it was believed Rome's fate would hang in the balance. The penalty was brutal, being buried alive in an underground chamber with only a little water and bread, a silent sacrifice to soothe the offended deities. This cruelty reminds us that Roman religion, however austere, also held a dark, merciless side that embraced suffering as part of the sacred balance. Roman gods bore a close resemblance to their Greek counterparts. Many were borrowed outright from Greece, given new names, and endowed with Roman traits. Jupiter was Rome's Zeus, Mars was Ares, Venus was Aphrodite. But unlike the Greek pantheon, known for dramatic tales and passionate tempers, Roman deities were more institutional. They were worshipped less out of emotional devotion and more out of civic duty. A god for every function, a prayer for every occasion, a temple for every vow. It was a pragmatic faith, one that allowed diverse cults to coexist peacefully. The Roman calendar overflowed with religious festivals, from the rollicking Saturnalia to the solemn Lemuria rites to placate restless dead. Every month had its celebrations, offerings, and taboos. The life of every Roman citizen, soldier, merchant, senator, or farmer was woven into this invisible web of spiritual obligations. No one escaped it. Salvation of the soul wasn't at stake. What mattered was the city's collective destiny. One of the most striking features of Roman religion was its openness. As Rome expanded, it absorbed the gods and rites of conquered peoples. Instead of destroying temples, the Romans integrated them, bringing statues to the city, building new shrines, and giving each deity a place in the Roman pantheon. This religious syncretism was strategic. It honored local traditions, eased political integration, and ensured no divine force could turn against Rome. They covered every front, even the invisible ones. Yet this tolerance had limits. Religion had to align with loyalty to the state. Worship had to be public, regulated, and conducted under Roman rules. Any faith that refused to participate in the system or claimed superiority over imperial authority was met with suspicion. Thus, in later centuries, Christianity, by denying emperor worship and rejecting the pagan gods, faced persecution not for its theology, but for breaking the sacred contract between individual, community, and the divine. For the Romans, religion was not an obstacle to rational thought or political progress, but an essential complement. Empire building, social reform, and the administration of justice all took place under the watchful eyes of the gods. Roman religiosity was not blind faith, but respect for order. The sacred and the political so intertwined that separating them would have sparked conceptual chaos. Over time, some leaders leveraged this bond even further. Julius Caesar became Pontifex Maximus before naming himself dictator. His successor, Augustus, skillfully used religious language to cement his authority. He declared himself restorer of traditional values, the chosen of the gods to bring peace. Temples rose at his command, old festivals were revived, and in many provinces he was worshipped as living divinity. In his hands, religion became the perfect tool to legitimize personal power without dismantling formal institutions. Throughout its history, Rome fashioned a religion that reinforced order, channeled collective emotion, and gave meaning to uncertainty. It wasn't about being right, but doing what was right. Belief in the gods was secondary to the performance of rites, the flawless enunciation of sacred words, and adherence to the calendar. And if the gods fell silent, if disaster struck or war dragged on, the Romans didn't doubt the deity's existence. They asked what ritual had been neglected, what sacrifice forgotten, what error committed. Until the very end, Rome lived in the conviction that divine will was legible, interpreted by priests, inscribed in temples, and reflected in the course of its history. Rome versus Carthage. For centuries, Rome had waged war against its neighbors, absorbed cities, founded colonies, and steadily extended its influence across the Italian peninsula. But when its legions looked beyond the Tyrrhenian Sea and set foot on Sicily, they encountered a power that didn't play by the same rules, that wasn't easily intimidated, that boasted centuries of trade, an immense fleet, and a wealth far exceeding that of any Italian city. That power was Carthage, and its very existence stood as a direct obstacle to any Roman ambition in the Mediterranean. What began as a local struggle for control of one island would erupt into a total, long, and devastating war between two very different worlds, and ultimately decide the fate of the entire ancient West. Carthage was a Phoenician city founded centuries earlier on the North African coast by merchants from Tyre. Its strength lay not in land or sword, but in the sea and in gold. From its harbor, the Carthaginians wove a commercial network stretching from the shores of Hispania to the islands of the Aegean, through Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, the Balearics, and the Strait of Gibraltar. Their fleet was swift, disciplined, efficient. Their armies were composed of mercenaries, allied troops, African, Iberian, Gallic, even Greek units, united under generals beholden to a mercantile aristocracy very different from Rome's political order. Where Rome saw land on which to found colonies, Carthage saw ports in which to trade. Where Rome sought political control, Carthage sought profit. Yet both hungered for the same prizes: power, space, security, and in the end, only one could claim the contested ground. The conflict ignited in Sicily, an island long a volatile blend of Greek city-states, native populations, and foreign garrisons. A local dispute among mercenaries in Messina drew in Rome. Carthage, already established on the island, retaliated. Neither power would back down, and without any formal declaration, the First Punic War began. It was a long struggle, clumsy at first for Rome, which lacked naval experience. The early years were disastrous. Roman ships were heavy, slow, and their crews untrained. But Rome refused to yield. They reverse-engineered Carthaginian designs, drilled their rowers, and introduced a game-changing innovation: the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that turned naval battles into land engagements, where Roman legions excelled. In time, This adaptation shifted the war's tide. After more than 20 years of clashes, shipwrecks, endless sieges, and millions of sesterces spent, Rome finally planted its banner in Sicily. Carthage was defeated and forced to pay a massive indemnity. But the peace was only a pause. The Carthaginians, weakened but not broken, began rebuilding their power in Hispania under the leadership of a family destined for legend, the Barcids. It was in this crucible that a young general emerged, Hannibal, raised from childhood to hate Rome. His father, Hamilcar, had made him swear never to befriend the Romans. That oath wasn't symbolic. It became the guiding principle of Hannibal's life. Hannibal realized Carthage couldn't defeat Rome in a head-on fight or by waiting passively for attack. He chose the unthinkable: bring the war into the heart of Italy. In a campaign both daring and legendary, he crossed the Pyrenees, marched through Gaul, and then traversed the Alps with an army of cavalry, heavy infantry, mercenaries, and war elephants. Many perished en route. Harsh weather, brutal terrain, and ambushes by local tribes turned the journey into hell. Yet he prevailed, arriving in northern Italy with forces weary but unwavering in will. What followed was a sequence of victories that brought Rome to its knees. At the Ticinus, the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and above all, Cannae, Hannibal revealed a strategist of unparalleled genius. At Cannae, his forces encircled and annihilated the Roman legions. Over 50,000 Romans fell in a single day in what remains Rome's greatest military humiliation to that point. Yet in the face of catastrophe, Rome's true character shone through. It refused to sue for peace or surrender. Instead, Rome raised fresh legions, tightened laws, and adopted a war of attrition, relentless resistance, peripheral strikes, and unyielding discipline. While Hannibal sought Italian allies, Rome strangled him through blockades and peripheral offensives. The general who ultimately tipped the balance was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later surnamed Africanus. Rather than chase Hannibal through Italy, Scipio struck Carthage's economic heart in Hispania and then in Africa. His methodical, brilliant campaign forced Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend the homeland. There, on the plains of Zama in 202 BC, the two greatest military minds of the age collided. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was humbled. Its navy shattered, its army disbanded, its foreign policy overseen by Rome. It was total victory, but not the end. For decades, Carthage tried to survive as a commercial city, honoring treaties, avoiding provocations, clinging to life. Yet in Rome, many could not tolerate its mere existence. Leading the drumbeat for destruction was Cato the Elder, who ended every Senate speech with the mantra, "Carthage must be destroyed." Finally, the moment came. Rome sent an army, demanded total surrender, ordered evacuation and dismantling. The Carthaginians resisted fiercely, 3 years of house-to-house, street-by-street fighting. But they could not hold out forever. In 146 BC, Carthage fell. Its inhabitants were enslaved. Its territory became a Roman province. Legend says Rome sowed salt into the earth so nothing would ever grow again, though proof is scant. What is certain is that the city was razed, erased from maps, and consigned to oblivion. Carthage's defeat marked Rome's unchallenged dominion over the western Mediterranean. No rival remained. Islands, African coasts, Hispania, and soon Greece would fall under Roman sway. But victory came at a cost. Rome had learned to wage protracted wars, to maintain standing armies, to govern an empire, and with that power came new internal challenges. While the external foe lay vanquished, tensions within Rome itself began to stir. Tensions that, in time, would shake the Republic to its core. But that is a story for another time. Here and now, Rome stands triumphant as the Mediterranean's unrivaled power, having outlasted its age's greatest general, crushed the city that challenged it for over a century, and proven that power is neither inherited nor purchased. It is conquered, imposed, defended, and when necessary, destroyed. Social crisis and failed reforms. After Rome's decisive triumph over Carthage, the city seemed unstoppable. Its legions had crushed their greatest foe. Its name commanded respect from the shores of Hispania to the plains of North Africa, and its republican institutions stood unscathed, as though neither time nor war had dented them. Yet beneath that facade of strength lay a widening fracture. While Rome conquered the outside world, its social fabric was unraveling from within, and the consequences would echo as the beginning of the Republic's end. The crisis did not erupt overnight. It was the culmination of years of territorial expansion, land accumulation, mass migration from countryside to city, institutional corruption, and an increasingly out-of-touch ruling class. At the heart of the turmoil was the land question. For centuries, small landowners had formed the backbone of Rome's army. Citizens who tilled their fields, paid taxes, and, when summoned, donned armor for the legions. But prolonged wars, distant campaigns, and the march of time had altered that dynamic. Many of these farmers perished in battle or spent years abroad fighting. Upon return, they found their plots abandoned, seized, or bought up by wealthy landowners who, exploiting their influence, appropriated vast tracts of public land. These estates, once the people's, were now worked by slaves imported from conquered provinces. The smallholder, powerless to compete, faced ruin, forced to sell his parcel or head to the city, only to encounter unemployment, destitution, or dependence on state grain handouts. Freed of its free citizen farmers, the countryside emptied, and the army felt the blow. Under Republican law, only property-owning citizens could bear arms. No land meant no enlistment. Rome's military foundation weakened precisely as its empire swelled. Meanwhile, in the city, inequality became starkly visible. The nobility amassed colossal wealth. Victorious generals returned with staggering spoils. Patrician villas brimmed with marble, slaves, and luxury. In the forums, thousands of jobless citizens clamored for state dole, painfully aware there was no place for them in this new Rome. Amid this turmoil rose leaders determined to heal the divide. First, and most famous, were the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, tribunes of the plebs who, though different in vision, shared the aim of halting the collapse through land reforms and laws favoring common citizens. Tiberius Gracchus led the charge. He proposed limiting how much land one could hold and redistributing illegally occupied public lands back to the people. His plan was fair, even moderate. It did not strip away private property or hereditary privilege, but enforced existing law. The Senate, however, erupted in fury, accusing him of seeking absolute power and pandering to the masses. When Tiberius sought re-election to press on with his reforms, he and hundreds of supporters were murdered in a Senate-instigated revolt. This unprecedented violence shook Rome's core. The assassination of a tribune, sacrosanct by law, marked a turning point. Yet Tiberius's cause did not die with him. Years later, his brother Gaius picked up the banner with even grander ambitions, redistributing land, curbing senatorial power, extending citizenship to Italian allies, and reining in magistrates' corruption. A gifted orator, he inspired the plebs but incurred powerful enemies. Armed gangs roamed the streets. In desperation, the Senate invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, treating Gaius as an enemy of the state. He was hunted, cornered, and chose suicide over capture, while thousands of his followers were executed. The Gracchi's deaths left an indelible scar on Rome's memory. Their reforms aimed to mend a creaking system, but the ferocity of their silencing proved that consensus no longer existed. Class struggle became permanent, and the Senate clung to privilege like a castaway clutches driftwood. Every reform threatened the established order, even as the roots of discontent deepened. Concurrently, Rome's Italian allies, who had fought and bled alongside citizens, demanded equal rights. They paid taxes, supplied troops, and bore the empire's burdens, yet had no vote or office. Their exclusion fueled fresh tensions, protests, and whispers of revolt. Rome, which had conquered half of Italy promising integration, reneged on its pledge. Inequality was no longer just economic, it was political and territorial. In the following decades, others tried to carry forward the reformist torch, but no longer with the Gracchi's idealism. They wielded tougher, murkier methods, seeking military backing. Soldiers, deprived of their livelihoods, shifted loyalty from the Republic to the general who promised them land, grain, and plunder. Thus, almost unawares, power began to shift. The Republic did not collapse then, but it lay wounded. Its institutions, consuls, senate, popular assemblies, remained formally intact, yet all operated under constant tension. Laws stalled, violence flared, and fiery speeches split citizens into irreconcilable camps. The post-Punic era was not an unbroken triumph, but a period of stark contradictions. Rome's global dominance coexisted with internal decay. Victory brought glory, riches, and territory, but also corruption, power concentration, moral decline, and glaring inequality. The city that once prided itself on balance now teetered on its own hubris. Reformers failed not for lack of ideas or need, but because Rome's power structure refused to yield. Those who challenged it were slain or sidelined. Survivors learned that only military might or unwavering popular support could win change. And so, Rome edged toward a new epoch, the age of strongmen, private armies, and civil wars pitting Roman against Roman for a republic that had ceased to belong to them all. The civil war between Marius and Sulla. In Rome's history, there came a moment when conflict turned inward, when the swords that once defended its frontiers were stained with the blood of countrymen, and the legions, once servants of the Republic, became instruments of personal ambition. The fragile institutional balance, already strained by decades of social tensions and failed reforms, finally snapped. That point of no return struck with devastating force during the Civil War between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, two men who embodied new forms of power in a Rome that had lost faith in its own rules. Gaius Marius was, in many ways, an anomaly within the Republican system. Born to a plebeian family with no consular pedigree, he rose through sheer military talent and political instinct. His ascent was meteoric. He made his name in the war against Jugurtha in North Africa and cemented his reputation commanding campaigns against the Cimbri and the Teutones, Germanic tribes that had shattered entire Roman armies. With a blend of pragmatism and boldness, Marius restructured the army, allowing property-less citizens to enlist. This reform solved the urgent problem of manpower, but in the long run it forever changed Rome's military logic. Those who once fought for civic duty now fought for land, loot, and the protection of their general, Marius himself. His popularity among the masses and the troops made him feared by the senatorial elite. Elected consul and unprecedented 7 times, he broke the mold of the traditional Republican magistrate. No longer a temporary office holder, he wielded influence that overflowed legal bounds and harbored ambitions beyond written norms. Sulla, by contrast, was an aristocrat. Of an impoverished patrician line yet proud of his lineage, he found his path to fame in the army. Serving under Marius during the Jugurthine War, he captured the Numidian king himself, an act celebrated in Rome but sowing the seeds of a silent rivalry. Sulla would not tolerate Marius taking all the credit, and Marius despised the rise of a young aristocrat daring to challenge him from within. For a time they coexisted, but as the Republic's decay deepened, so did their tensions. In 88 BC, the fuse finally ignited. The Senate appointed Sulla to command the critical expedition against Mithridates VI of Pontus, whose brutal onslaught in Asia Minor had slaughtered thousands of Roman citizens. As Sulla prepared to depart, the People's Assembly, manipulated by Marius's allies, revoked his command and handed it to the seasoned plebeian general. This act was a provocation and a constitutional rupture, a clear defiance of senatorial authority. Sulla reacted like no one before. He rallied his legions, the same forces meant for Mithridates, and marched on Rome. It was the first time a Roman commander brought an army across Italy's borders to attack his own city. This was civil war, but also a grim preview of what was to come. Rome, defenseless, fell to Sulla, who restored order in his own brutal way, declaring public enemies, proscribing opponents, and then setting off for the Eastern campaign, leaving the city in fear and uncertainty. Marius fled to Africa, hunted by his foes. But not for long. As Sulla ventured east, his supporters in Rome lost power, and Marius, backed by his partisans and his enduring military prestige, returned. He stormed the city, purged his enemies, and was once again named consul, hardened by exile and thirsting for vengeance. Yet his triumph was fleeting. He died soon after, setting the stage for the next act of conflict. Years later, Sulla returned victorious from Mithridates. But he did not come back as consul or mere general. He returned as absolute master of power. With his legions at his back, he occupied Rome, crushed Marius's followers, and unleashed systematic purges. He enacted the infamous proscriptions, public lists of enemies of the state whose lives were forfeit and whose properties were confiscated. Killing a proscribed person was legal and rewarded. Their families were dishonored, their names erased from official records. Sulla declared himself dictator without time limit, something no Roman law had envisioned since the Republic's early centuries. He reformed the judiciary, curtailed the tribunes of the plebs, bolstered the Senate's authority, and reshaped the political body to restore aristocratic control. He claimed to act in the name of tradition and lost order, even as he trampled the very republic he professed to save. Remarkably, after instituting his reforms, he resigned his office and retired to his villa, dying shortly thereafter. But the damage was done. Rome never fully recovered from that civil war. Institutions lost prestige, laws ceased to restrain powerful men. The army answered to generals' charisma more than to the state. Purges, exiles, and vengeance became the norm. Worst of all, Marius and Sulla's example opened the door for others. If they could cross the symbolic Rubicon of legality, who would not? The clash between Marius and Sulla was more than a feud of two ambitious men. It was a battle of visions, of social classes, of what Rome should be. Though both died convinced they had saved the Republic, they left it gasping, its spirit fractured, its laws powerless against men with armies. Rome, built on virtue, discipline, and law, had entered a dark new era where glory flowed with the blood of its own citizens. Remember this turning point, and let it inspire you to value laws, traditions, and the courage to defend them, whatever the challenge. The Rebellion of Spartacus. There was a moment in Rome's history when the greatest enemy of the Republic was not a foreign army, nor an ambitious general, nor a treacherous ally, but a slave. There was an instant in Rome when the mightiest threat to the Republic arose not from across its borders, but from within its very heart. A man without rank, without citizenship, without rights. A gladiator who, armed only with the instinct for freedom, and surrounded by men with nothing to lose, ignited an uprising that shook the foundations of the most formidable power of the ancient world. His name was Spartacus, and his story was not merely a rebellion, but a defiant cry that pierced the soul of the empire and, for a fleeting moment, revealed the fragility of Roman order. Slavery in Rome was neither marginal nor an unfortunate exception. It was the very cornerstone of the system. Millions of people were the property of others, not citizens, not even truly seen as human under the law, but economic instruments, cogs in the domestic agricultural, and military machine. They worked in kitchens, fields, workshops, palaces, and temples. Some were educated, doctors, teachers, while others were reduced to human beasts of burden, condemned to die in mines or on galleys. And for the strongest, the quickest, those who could bite through pain itself, the arena awaited. Spartacus had once been one of them. Of Thracian origin, captured by Rome's legions or sold by his own countrymen, he arrived in Italy as a prisoner of war. Bought by a lanista, a manager of gladiators, and taken to the famous school at Capua, he was trained to entertain by wielding sword and shield in mock combat, living every day with the certainty that one day he would be cast into the spectacle of death. Yet Spartacus was not born to obey. Alongside fellow gladiators, he plotted an escape that, under any other circumstances, would have ended in immediate slaughter. But this time, something extraordinary happened. With about 70 men, they fled the school and took refuge on the slopes of Vesuvius. Armed with kitchen knives and farming tools, they faced the first Roman detachment sent to crush them, and against all odds, they won. Word spread, and more came. Runaway slaves, landless peasants, shepherds, men without name, without hope. In weeks, the band swelled to a multitude. The riot became a movement, and Spartacus evolved from fugitive gladiator to the commander of a mass uprising. Rome was slow to grasp the danger. At first, they saw mere unrest, something a patrol or ad hoc legion could suppress. But Spartacus proved a master tactician. He organized camps, imposed discipline, secured supply lines, and struck legions sent against him, moving through southern Italy like a phantom army, swift, elusive, unstoppable. His adversaries were mediocre senatorial commanders, not seasoned generals, and each victory fed his cause. For 2 years, Spartacus held the Republic in check. He swept through Campania, Lucania, and Apulia, even nearing the gates of Rome, though never intending a direct assault. His aim, it seems, was flight, not conquest. Evidence suggests he planned to cross the Alps and scatter his followers to their homelands. Yet circumstances, internal divisions, and the very logic of war drew him southward again. Some sought vengeance, plunder, destruction. The slave army, ever growing, began to fracture. Then the Senate acted decisively, handing command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a fabulously wealthy aristocrat hungry for military glory. Crassus would not repeat his predecessor's mistakes. He reformed the legions, enforced brutal discipline, including the dreaded decimation, executing every 10th soldier in a unit that fled, and thus restored order through fear. He sought not only victory, but a lesson. The final clash was inevitable. Cornered in Calabria, Spartacus sought to negotiate a crossing to Sicily and plotted fresh routes of escape, but found himself trapped between Crassus's legions and those of Pompey, returning from Spain to join the hunt. Choosing to fight, he met his end in a ferocious battle, reportedly falling amidst enemies, fighting to his last breath. His body was never identified. His mortal form dissolved into legend. In the aftermath, Crassus crucified over 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, an appalling display of power, a warning that freedom bore a deadly price. For days, travelers passed row upon row of impaled bodies, reminders that defiance invited annihilation. Yet Spartacus's rebellion did not vanish from Rome's memory. It remained a collective trauma, not out of fear of an immediate repeat, but because it exposed a disquieting truth. Rome's greatness rested on the backs of an enslaved multitude, perpetually poised on the brink of desperation. A single spark, a single man, had threatened the mightiest empire of its age. The slaves did not triumph, but their uprising left an indelible mark. Spartacus became both a cautionary tale and, albeit grudgingly, a figure of admiration. Even the conservative Cicero acknowledged his courage. Centuries later, his name would echo as a symbol of resistance against oppression in worlds far removed from his own. Rome endured as an empire of slaves. Its economic foundations remained intact, its values unchanged. Yet the cracks had been laid bare. From the margins, a force could rise and challenge even the most disciplined military machine. Spartacus had no professional army, no senate, no allies, no resources, only will and cause. In a world where freedom was a luxury of the few, he proved that the forgotten could rise and carve history, if only for a moment, and even if it cost them everything. The ambition of Caesar and the end of the Republic. There are figures in history who don't merely participate in their age, they shape it. Julius Caesar was one of those figures. His life was too grand, too complex, and too ambitious to be contained by the framework of the Roman Republic. In him converged military genius, political charisma, strategic boldness, and an uncanny ability to read the currents of power and anticipate the next move before his rivals even realized it was too late. Yet Caesar represents more than just a man. He embodies a process, the final chapter of a republic that for centuries had feigned balance while real power drifted, imperceptibly at first, then inexorably, into the hands of the most determined. Born into a once illustrious patrician family, Caesar was never merely unknown. The Julii name carried weight in Rome's oldest memories, and he exploited every thread of that heritage, however slight. Even in youth, his intelligence, resolve, and unshakable self-confidence set him apart. He surrounded himself with influential allies, won renown as an orator, an administrator, a public figure. He never rushed, but he was never idle. He understood that in a system growing ever more corrupt, one had to forge alliances, show generosity to friends and cruelty to foes, and above all, win the people's devotion. In this context emerged the so-called First Triumvirate, an informal yet potent alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Each brought something different. Crassus the wealth, Pompey the military prestige, Caesar the magnetism and vision. They never inked a public pact or sought Senate approval. Instead, they ruled from the shadows, controlling offices, picking candidates, manipulating votes. It was a republic in name only. And within that trio, Caesar moved with the greatest cunning. After securing the consulship and consolidating his influence in Rome, Caesar was appointed governor of Gaul. What should have been a routine posting became an epic campaign. For nearly a decade, he personally led the conquest of that vast territory, battling diverse tribes, enduring punishing winters, and writing, quite literally with his own hand, the accounts of his victories. His commentaries on the Gallic War were never mere military reports. They were propaganda masterpieces. Week after week, Rome read of its generals' feats. The Senate grew uneasy, but the people cheered. Those campaigns did more than win glory. They won real power. His legions adored him. They owed him their triumphs, their spoils, their future hopes. They were loyal to Caesar, not to the Republic. That personal bond between commander and troops was the true foundation of what came next. Meanwhile, tensions with the Senate mounted. Crassus had fallen in a failed eastern campaign. Pompey, once an ally, drifted toward the conservative Senate factions. The balance tipped, and as Caesar's term neared its end, his enemies in Rome demanded he return as a private citizen, stripped of immunity, to face charges, trials, and neutralization. But Caesar refused. He would not go back without guarantees. Then he made the decision that changed history. He crossed the Rubicon, that modest river marking the boundary of Italy. He did so at the head of his legions, in an act that shattered all republican laws. The message was unmistakable. He would risk everything, even civil war, rather than submit. His reputed words were simple and absolute. The die is cast. What followed was inevitable conflict. Pompey fled to the east to muster forces. The Senate scattered. Caesar marched into Rome unopposed. Declared a public enemy by his adversaries, he remained the most powerful man in the Roman world. He pursued Pompey not out of personal hatred, but because his mere existence threatened Caesar's complete control. At Pharsalus in Greece, their armies clashed, and once more, Caesar prevailed. Pompey fled to Egypt, only to be murdered on the orders of the young pharaoh Ptolemy, who hoped to curry favor with the victor. Yet Caesar did not reward such treachery. When he arrived in Alexandria, he condemned the killing. In those tumultuous Egyptian days, he met Cleopatra. Their bond was more than romance. It was a political, cultural, and symbolic alliance. Returning to Rome, he brought not only victory, but the sway of the East, unvarnished ambition, and the vision of a world under a single will. In the years that followed, he ruled as dictator, first for limited terms, then with ever greater powers, until the Senate, powerless to resist, named him Dictator Perpetuo. To many, that was the Republic's death knell. The forms remained, magistrates still held office, the Senate still convened, but everything revolved around Caesar. He enacted sweeping reforms, canceling debts, extending citizenship, reorganizing provinces, curbing governors' abuses, granting land to veterans, and introducing a new calendar that would mark time for centuries. His rule was efficient, but also vertical, personalized, and immune to debate. For the old Republican aristocracy, that concentration of power was intolerable, not for its achievements, but for what it symbolized. A single man replacing checks and balances with his will. Not everyone hated him. Some even among his enemies admired him, but they feared what would come next. They feared he would crown himself king. A conspiracy formed among senators, former allies, men who felt their world slipping away. Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had favored, protected, and loved like a son. The betrayal, when it came, was merciless. On the Ides of March in 44, before Christ, Caesar was stabbed to death in the Curia by those who claimed to defend the Republic. His death was theatrical, brutal, symbolic. He fell at the feet of Pompey's statue, as if history itself were closing a bloody circle. But his murder did not restore the Republic. Instead, it unleashed even greater chaos. Rome fractured, civil wars returned, and the very outcome the conspirators sought to avoid, the absolute concentration of power, became unavoidable. Caesar was gone, but his shadow endured. His heir, Gaius Octavian, his adopted great-nephew, would soon be known as Augustus. Under him, the empire was born in earnest. Julius Caesar, with his conquests, genius, ambition, and tragedy, did not destroy the Republic out of whim. He exposed its failure. He corrupted it, yes, but he also revealed its truth, a system incapable of confronting real power. His life encapsulates the transition between two worlds, and his death confirms that Rome could never turn back. Augustus and the dawn of the empire. When Julius Caesar fell on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 before Christ, no one could predict what shape Rome would take out of that power vacuum. His death, far from restoring the Republic, plunged the city into a fresh spiral of chaos and unbridled ambition. The Senate had rid itself of the dictator, but it had no plan to fill the void he left behind. What followed was a protracted, bitter, and deeply personal struggle for control of the Roman world. And into that maelstrom stepped an unexpected figure, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's young adopted heir, who would forever alter Rome's destiny under the name Augustus. Octavian was scarcely 18 when he learned that Caesar had named him his adopted son and chief legatee. Fragile in health, lacking military experience, with no power base in the Senate and outnumbered by enemies, he seemed an unlikely contender. Mark Antony, Caesar's seasoned lieutenant, already occupied the foremost political position and assumed he would inherit Caesar's mantle. Few took Octavian seriously, yet the youth mastered the art of timing, alliances, and image. He never portrayed himself as a power-hungry upstart, but as a devoted son claiming his father's inheritance. In a city torn by fear and uncertainty, his prudent stance became his greatest weapon. The years that followed were woven with alliances, betrayals, negotiations, and military campaigns. Octavian joined forces with Antony and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned partnership, unlike the first, that granted them near absolute authority. They divided Rome's territories, eliminated common enemies, and unleashed a ruthless campaign of reprisals, including the infamous proscriptions, blacklists of citizens sentenced to death without trial. Among the victims was the celebrated orator Cicero, whose head was displayed in the Forum as a grim warning. Revenge for Caesar was finally exacted at the Battle of Philippi, where the triumvir's armies crushed Brutus and Cassius. Both committed suicide, and defenders of the old republic vanished from the stage. But peace was short-lived. As expected, the partnership between Octavian and Antony unraveled. Lepidus was sidelined with little resistance, and the contest narrowed to two men, two visions for Rome's future. Antony, charismatic and impetuous with strong military backing, had relocated to the east and allied himself with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Their political and personal union scandalized Rome. Octavian seized on every gesture, every excess, every choice of his rival to cast himself as the guardian of traditional values, protector of Italy, and restorer of lost order. While Antony wrote dispatches from Alexandria, Octavian spoke to the Senate, the people, and the veterans, weaving a narrative that only he could secure stability. The showdown came at the naval battle of Actium on September 2, 31 BC. In a clash both decisive and symbolic, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his gifted Admiral Agrippa, overwhelmed Antony and Cleopatra's ships, forcing them to flee to Egypt. A year later, they took their own lives. Octavian did not enter Alexandria as a conquering tyrant, but as the heir of order. He provided honorable burials for his defeated foes, seized the Egyptian treasury to pay his soldiers, and returned to Rome wielding absolute authority that none dared challenge. Yet he learned from Caesar's missteps. He never proclaimed himself dictator, never openly defied the Senate, never abolished republican institutions. Instead, he preserved their forms, respected them in appearance, and restored much of their dignity. In 27 BC, he staged a grand ceremony in which he publicly surrendered his powers to the Senate and the Roman people. Struck by his humility, the Senate bestowed upon him honorifics, princeps, first among equals, and Augustus, a new title evoking majesty without royalty. With those words, a new regime was born. No kings, no dictators, no crowns, yet Augustus held supreme power. Over the following decades, he ruled with prudence and efficiency. He centralized the key levers of state, control of the army, foreign policy, finances, and legislation, while maintaining the facade of republican governance. Consuls were still elected, the Senate still deliberated, assemblies still met. It was a brilliantly crafted illusion. The republic lived on its surface, even as the empire truly rose. Augustus reformed the civil service, established a professional army with pensions for veterans, launched grand public works, and secured internal peace unseen for generations. The celebrated Pax Romana ushered in an era of prosperity and stability that would define the Mediterranean world for over 2 centuries. But his power was not merely institutional or military. It was symbolic. Augustus understood better than anyone the force of narrative. He championed a revival of traditional values, family, religion, public morality. Through patronage, he supported poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, who wove a renewed mythos of Rome. In the Aeneid, Aeneas's destiny mirrored that of Augustus himself, as though the gods had ordained his rule. By the end of his life, Augustus had achieved what once seemed impossible. He founded a monarchy without the appearance of monarchy, controlled the state without dismantling its republican facade, and remained unchallenged for over 40 years. When he died in AD 14, the Senate declared him a god, and his name became forever linked to the dawn of the Roman Empire. What began as a bid to restore the Republic became a new form of governance. The Republic was now but an empty shell, a decorative relic, while the empire reigned under a single man. Though his successor Tiberius would rule with less charm and greater severity, the model was set. The empire had been born through blood, strategy, and political theater, and at its heart stood Augustus, the man who made Rome the capital of the world without ever shattering its past. The splendor and imperial control. After Augustus's death, Rome did not collapse, did not fall into crisis, nor return to the anarchy of civil wars. Quite the opposite. The new system he had designed, carefully veiled as a continuation of the Republic, stood firm and kept growing like a self-propelling engine that no longer needed dramatic jolts to keep moving. A solid, long-lasting power structure had been born, with reorganized institutions, fortified borders, a flourishing economy, and a collective imagination that not only accepted, but in many cases celebrated, the concentration of authority in a single figure. The empire, both as a form of government and as a cultural reality, was entering one of its most brilliant phases. An era marked by visible grandeur, monumental works, territorial expansion, but also by a deep, ever-present, invisible control that ensured everything ran smoothly without surprises. The emperors who followed Augustus, at least during the first decades, understood that power no longer lay solely in victory on the battlefield or dominance over the Senate. It meant maintaining a delicate balance between tradition and centralism, between imperial will and the image of stability. Tiberius, his direct heir, reluctantly assumed command, more administrator than warlord, more watchful than popular leader. He ruled for over 20 years, kept the peace, balanced the state's finances, but also instilled an atmosphere of surveillance and fear, amplified by a network of informers, a practice that would become commonplace in imperial politics. One need not be loved if one could be feared. That maxim, later popularized by Machiavelli, was already taking shape in the everyday practices of Roman power. With time, the machinery of state grew ever more refined. The Senate, though stripped of real power, remained as a formal space of legitimization. The provinces were administered by imperial legates who answered directly to the emperor. The army evolved into a standing professional force, with legions strategically stationed along the frontiers in camps that would eventually become entire cities. A military career became a path to advancement for many, and loyalty was guaranteed with privileges, regular pay, and land grants upon discharge. Everything was calculated. Nothing was left to chance. In Rome, the capital of the world, splendor was palpable. Emperors commissioned temples, aqueducts, forums, theaters, baths, markets, and monuments that turned the city into a permanent showcase of power. Each structure served a practical purpose and a symbolic one. To walk through Rome was to stroll among marble columns, statues of emperors and gods, inscriptions commemorating victories, constructions, and reforms. The urban landscape spoke for itself, commanding respect and instructing both citizen and foreigner. The empire was not just force, it was planned beauty. Citizenship became a political tool. What had once been an exclusive privilege began to spread as a form of integration. Conquered peoples could join the system. They were granted rights, protection, and opportunities. In return, obedience, taxes, and military service were expected. This policy transformed Rome from a dominant city into a civilization that projected itself across a mosaic of languages, cultures, and customs. One could be Roman in Hispania, Africa, Syria, or Britannia, not by blood, but by political and cultural bond. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, stretching from Augustus to Nero, shaped the profile of imperial power. Though each emperor brought personal differences, the core of the regime remained constant. Caligula's eccentricity and madness took political theater to extremes. Claudius, dismissed as clumsy by his enemies, surprised many with his administrative skill. Nero, remembered for fires and persecutions, was also an urban and artistic reformer. Yet all reaffirmed that the emperor was more than a magistrate. He was the personification of the state. During this period, surveillance and control became routine mechanisms for maintaining unity. Provinces were overseen by informants. Governors accounted for every decision. Major measures required imperial approval. Excesses were punished, but the system allowed considerable autonomy so long as the core of power was respected. In that balance, between rigidity and flexibility, lay the empire's stability. Simultaneously, the army assumed a premier political role. Though the emperor held formal command, his legitimacy depended on the legion's support. The title Imperator was not mere rhetoric. It was a military reality. The frontier, the border between the known and the barbarian, became central. There, walls like Hadrian's in Britannia were built. Fortresses stretched for thousands of kilometers, and outposts sprang up where daily life fused with defense. But control was not exercised by arms alone. Legal systems regulated everything from trade to inheritance. Codes were drafted, censuses organized, taxes collected regularly. The empire craved information, and it gathered it efficiently. Roads not only moved armies, but also officials, goods, and imperial messages. An order could cross the Mediterranean in weeks, a dizzying pace for its time. The balance of splendor and oversight endured for years, thanks to a precise mix of authority, administrative efficiency, calculated concessions, and propaganda. Emperors presented themselves as father figures to the people, wise judges, guardians of the Roman legacy. They commanded, but also cared. They legislated, and also staged public games, races, and spectacles that made citizens feel at home in Rome, even if they no longer decided its destiny. Religion, too, was woven into the machinery of power. The emperor cult, tentatively introduced by Augustus, became institutionalized in the provinces. Belief wasn't mandatory, but participation was. Temples to the emperor stood alongside those of traditional gods. Festivals, offerings, and processions reminded everyone who guaranteed peace, bread, and order. This period, truly one of imperial consolidation, was far from perfect. There were revolts, betrayals, palace intrigues, and occasional crises. Yet overall, Rome enjoyed a stability unknown in its republican past. The machine worked, and while citizens lived, traded, educated their children, and cheered in the circus, the empire kept turning, ever wider, ever more complex, ever more interconnected. What's remarkable is not that absolute power existed, but that it was accepted as normal, even desirable. Splendor did not hide control, it justified it. Citizens gazed upon columns, fountains, roads, and markets, understanding that such magnificence required order. Rome was no longer a city of peasant soldiers or debating senators. It was the capital of a world. And for that world to endure, power had to remain firm, centralized, absolute. The most feared emperors. Rome had learned to live under the rule of a single man. What began as an extraordinary concentration of power became an institutional norm. The empire did not rest solely on the strength of its legions or the efficiency of its bureaucracy, but also on the image of the emperor as a paternal figure, a symbol of order and continuity. Yet that very concentration of power that brought stability also carried a profound risk. When the man at the top of the world lost his mind, turned cruel, arbitrary, or paranoid, there was no brake to stop him. And at several moments in its history, Rome had to confront that abyss. not on the battlefield or at its borders, but at its very heart. Among all the emperors who embodied this dark side of power, 3 names stand out: Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. Each lived in different eras, under different circumstances, yet all 3 personified, in their time, the fear that the imperial office could become something monstrous, unrecognizable, and uncontrollable. Caligula came to power after the death of Tiberius, amid a wave of hope. He was young, popular, a direct descendant of Augustus on his mother's side, and the son of General Germanicus, an immensely admired figure among both soldiers and citizens. During his first months of rule, it seemed as though a spirit of justice and renewal, long lost, would be restored. But something snapped quickly. Ancient sources recount a sudden illness that twisted his character, though this may be a symbolic way to explain his descent into madness. Caligula began to act as if he were a living god. Ruling was not enough. He demanded worship. He ordered statues of himself erected in temples reserved for the gods. He insisted on grand titles, demanded sacrifices, and addressed the Senate with barely concealed contempt. Legend says he even appointed his own horse, Incitatus, as consul, though modern historians believe this was a sardonic jab at a Senate he considered little more than a tame herd. Beyond these anecdotes, his reign grew unpredictable and violent. He ordered executions without trial, mass exiles and confiscations to fund his excessive luxuries. Anyone who displeased him, or who was too wealthy or too popular, could vanish overnight. Fear gripped Rome. The powerless Senate approved whatever was presented. Yesterday's allies became today's enemies. Absolute power had ceased to be a tool of governance and had become a constant threat. Caligula ruled for only 4 years, but his impact was so deep that, when members of his own guard finally assassinated him, no one tried to stop them. His death was hailed as liberation, yet the very system that enabled his tyranny remained untouched. Years later, Nero would inherit this legacy with a more refined theatricality, but equally sinister consequences. His rise to power was meticulously orchestrated by his mother, Agrippina the Younger, an ambitious and manipulative force who secured him as Claudius's heir. At first, Nero was presented as a virtuous young man, tutored by Seneca, surrounded by wise counselors, and projecting an almost artistic vision of authority. But soon his narcissism emerged, obsessed with fame, public image, and leaving a mark that was more aesthetic than political. Nero fancied himself an artist. He performed on stage, sang, recited poetry, and staged games with himself as the star attraction. For traditional Romans, this was scandalous. An emperor should be austere, sober, devoted to governance, not a showman craving applause. But what came next was truly alarming. Like Caligula, Nero removed all who could limit him. First his mother, whom he had killed, then his tutor Seneca, who was forced to commit suicide, and later his wife Octavia, executed on false charges. His reign became a spiral of purges, real or fabricated plots, and ever more arbitrary decrees. The Great Fire of Rome in 64, before Christ, marked a turning point. As the city burned, many accused him of setting the blaze to rebuild Rome in his image. True or not, what followed was equally dramatic. To deflect blame, Nero scapegoated a small sect of believers who refused to join state cults, Christians. Thus began one of the empire's first and most brutal religious persecutions: public executions, horrific tortures in the arenas, and spectacular displays of suffering as entertainment. Power, once again, was wielded as a tool of terror. Nero's end matched that of many before him. Cornered, betrayed, abandoned by the army, and declared a public enemy by the Senate. He took his own life at 30, leaving behind a Rome burdened with debt, fractured, and sliding into the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors. Yet his legacy, like Caligula's, was more symbolic than structural. the fear of unchecked power, and the certainty that one man's delusions could drag the Roman world into personal ruin. In the late 2nd century, that shadow returned with Commodus, son of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the wisest and most revered in imperial history. Commodus shattered the golden tradition of prudence, philosophy, and rational governance. Raised in opulence, surrounded by flatterers, convinced from childhood of his divine right, Commodus treated the empire as an extension of his ego. He fought in gladiatorial contests, collected rewards for defeating unarmed opponents, posed as Hercules in sculptures, and demanded worship as a living demigod. He ruled on a whim, delegated decisions to incompetent favorites, and reduced Rome to a tragic parody of its former glory. His assassination in 192, before Christ by those closest to him, closed a dark chapter. The Senate decreed his memory be erased, a practice known as damnatio memoria, and his name was removed from inscriptions and coins. Yet as before, the damage could not be undone. The imperial system survived, but with each of these rulers, respect for law, institutional balance, and the dignity of the office eroded a little more. What these emperors left behind, beyond violence and eccentricity, was a warning about the vulnerability of concentrated power. Rome created an efficient, enduring system admired across the ancient world, but its very structure harbored the risk that an unscrupulous man could turn the state into his plaything. And when that happened, no senate, no law, no tradition could stop him in time. Everyday life in Rome. When we think of Rome, the first images that come to mind are often emperors, vast armies, distant conquests, epic battles, or temples that still defy the march of time. Yet what sustained that civilization, what gave it continuity and purpose, was not the decisions of the powerful, but the daily lives of millions who walked its streets, worked its fields, raised their children, baked its bread, shared its wine, prayed to its gods, or cheered from the circus stands. That silent world of ordinary days was as truly Roman as the marbles of the Forum or the legions in Germania. Rome was, above all, a bursting metropolis. As the empire grew, the capital absorbed people, customs, languages, accents, fashions, and dishes from every corner of the Mediterranean. Over 1 million souls lived there, unthinkable for ancient times, and such numbers demanded an urban network both complex and ever on edge. Narrow, grimy, bustling streets teemed with carts, street vendors, beggars, prostitutes, artisans, children racing about, hurried officials, philosophers debating in columned shadows, watchful soldiers, and slaves bearing heavy loads. Each day was a symphony of orchestrated chaos, where survival hinged not just on status or wealth, but on knowing how to navigate and tune yourself to a city that never truly slept. Homes laid bare the stark inequality of Roman society. In wealthy districts, houses were spacious, adorned with frescoes, mosaics, interior fountains, and gardens. In poorer quarters, life unfolded in insulae, hastily built apartment blocks of cheap materials where entire families squeezed into a single room, without running water or private kitchens, always under the threat of fire or collapse. The higher the floor, the cheaper the rent, and the more precarious the conditions. The middle class hovered uncertainly between comfort and need, teetering between respectable citizenship and the brink of ruin from a bad harvest, illness, or political decree. Feeding Rome was a constant challenge. Grain sailed in from Sicily, Egypt, or North Africa, docking at Ostia, the main port, then shipped inland along the Tiber to the heart of the city. The state distributed it free to registered citizens, a social pact more than an act of generosity. A well-fed populace was less likely to revolt. Alongside grain came chickpeas, lentils, figs, wine, olive oil, and salted fish. Roman diets were simple: cereals, fruits, and vegetables day to day, with meat reserved for special occasions. In the markets, pungent aromas mingled with vendors' cries, endless haggling, and a chorus of accents spanning the empire. Romans were deeply ritualistic. Religion permeated every aspect of daily life, not as an abstract faith, but as a system of practices organizing time, space, and social bonds. In every home, the lararium, a small domestic altar, held images of protective household gods, the lares and penates. Each morning began with an offering, a prayer, a gesture of respect. Throughout the streets, temples rose in honor of major and minor deities from Jupiter to Janus, and religious festivals, like the Saturnalia, broke routine with feasts, gifts, temporary license, and mass celebrations that, for a fleeting moment, put slaves and free citizens on equal footing. Leisure was essential to Roman identity. Heading to the Circus Maximus for chariot races, the amphitheater for gladiatorial contests or public executions, or the theaters for comedies and tragedies formed the cultural pulse. But the social hub, especially for male citizens, was the public baths. The baths offered far more than cleanliness. They were meeting places for conversation, business, politics, and rest. There, one read, played games, exercised and debated ideas, rich and poor, philosophers and merchants, war veterans and young idlers, all mingled for the price of a small entrance fee. Family structure followed strict hierarchy. The pater familias, the adult male head of the household, held legal and moral authority over all family members and slaves. He arranged marriages, meted out punishment, oversaw education, and even, in extreme cases, decided life or death. Yet in practice, this idealized role was more flexible. Roman women, though barred from political office, played active roles in the economy, religious life, household management, and social networks. Many owned property, ran businesses, and wielded significant influence behind the scenes. Slavery was woven into the fabric of Roman order. Millions were owned, born into bondage, captured in war, punished or enslaved by debt. Slaves worked kitchens, fields, theaters, mines, and brothels. Some received humane treatment, education, and manumission. Others suffered inhuman conditions with no hope of freedom. The cruelest aspect was its normalization. A slave's value determined by utility, always considered property, not person. Yet many slaves became indispensable domestic managers, tutors to their owners' children, stewards of businesses, and confidants until death. Roman childhood was fleeting. Boys trained early for the forum or the battlefield. Girls prepared for marriage, household management, and motherhood. Formal education, available to those who could afford it, taught reading, writing, rhetoric, Greek, and law, often under the tutelage of educated slave teachers. Yet true schooling was life itself, observing daily rituals, assisting fathers in their tasks, listening to stories at the dinner table or public baths, and above all, learning to embody the virtues of honor and duty. Free days followed the religious calendar, which divided the year into fasti, days for work, and nefasti, days sacred to the gods when official business ceased. On these holy days, games were held, sacrifices offered, families visited one another, and the city decked itself in garlands, banners, and torchlit processions. Spectacle served as social glue. Lastly, death was not taboo, but part of life's cycle. Funerals were public affairs with processions, eulogies, and feasts. Romans believed the dead remained present among the living and deserved remembrance and honor. Tombs lined the roads outside the city walls, a lasting gallery of names and faces. Those milestones, visible to all, reminded passers-by of lives once lived on these same streets, preserving them in eternity. This was Rome when it wasn't at war or pulling new laws from ink to scroll, a living, complex, vibrant city where each day was a choreography of customs, gestures, and routines. A civilization that built its greatness in the smallest details: how it prepared a meal, sat to converse, or watch time pass from a fountain's edge or the circus stands. It is in this everyday world, more than in the marble halls of the Senate, that the heartbeat of ancient Rome still echoes today. The spectacle of the Colosseum. If there is one place in the world that embodies, in stone, form, and purpose, the very spirit of Imperial Rome, it is the Colosseum. A monument to both grandeur and horror, an eternal symbol of a civilization obsessed with glory, with controlling the masses, and with spectacle as a political, educational, and emotional tool. Erected atop the ruins of an imperial palace, the Colosseum was not only an architectural marvel, but a message carved in marble. Rome could destroy the excesses of its own emperors and upon their ashes raise a temple dedicated to the people, to their leisure, to their ritualized violence. Its construction began under Vespasian's rule around the year 70 before Christ and was inaugurated under his son Titus a decade later. The chosen site was no accident. There lay the artificial lake of Nero's Domus Aurea. To erase that space, to drain its waters, and to build in its place a public arena of such magnitude was a decision heavy with symbolism. It was a declaration of rupture with the hated tyrant's rule and an apparent restitution of power to the people of Rome. Where once only the emperor could tread, now more than 50,000 citizens could enter, seated according to status, yet all, at last, within the same enclosure. From the outside, the Colosseum commanded respect. Its travertine arcades, its stacked Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, its numbered entrances, and its statues on each level gave the impression of a universe contained within itself. But it was upon entering that one grasped the true scale of the project. 4 tiers of seating, internal ramps, distribution corridors, secret passages for the gladiators, trapdoors for beasts, stairways leading to vantage points. Everything was designed for a constant flow of crowds, so that they would arrive, watch, cheer, eat, bet, celebrate, fear, and then return home feeling they had witnessed something larger than life itself. The Colosseum was no ordinary theater. There were no mythical dramas in verse, no recited Greek tragedies. Here the drama was real, or at least it seemed so. War, the hunt, death, the human body pushed to its limits. These were the performances. Contemporary chronicles tell us the inaugural games lasted 100 days, during which thousands of animals and hundreds of men perished. Beasts brought from the empire's farthest reaches, lions, hippos, elephants, rhinoceroses, bears, panthers, giraffes, each species a tangible symbol of Rome's reach. The arena ran red with the blood of Africa, Asia, and Europe for the delight of the crowd. The show was organized with military precision. At dawn came the venaciones, hunts where professional beast hunters, sometimes condemned criminals, sometimes specialized gladiators, faced wild animals. Next were the executions, ad bestias, public executions in which condemned prisoners were thrown to the lions. It was both a solemn lesson and a spectacle. Death here served as a demonstration of state power, justice, and the capacity to punish. The bloodshed was at once a deterrent, entertainment, and reaffirmation of order. But the highlight arrived afterward: the gladiatorial combat. Armed men trained in special schools fought under strict rules, using varied weapons and styles. The retiarius, light and swift, armed with a net and trident, faced the secutor, heavy, protected by a smooth helmet. The murmillo, with his rectangular shield and short sword, clashed with the thrakes, more agile and wielding curved arms. It was no mere brawl but a choreography of violence, with technique, strategy, and an aesthetic sense. The audience roared, chose favorites, applauded maneuvers, jeered at cowardice. It was a bloody ballet in which applause could mean glory, and silence could signal a death sentence. Not all gladiators were slaves. though many were. Some fought by choice, for fame or fortune. Even senators, in times of moral decay or pure exhibitionism, would descend into the arena to touch Rome's brutal heart. Most fighters were owned by lanistae, entrepreneurs who trained, rented out, sold, and prepared them like today's elite athletes. Victory brought prizes, recognition, and sometimes freedom. The most celebrated became idols, their names echoed in the streets, their portraits painted on walls, women begging to be their lovers. To die in the arena was one destiny. To survive could grant unimaginable glory. Emperors wielded the games to seduce the masses. Gifted days of spectacle were an effective way to quell unrest, to distract from hunger or distant wars. Bread and circuses, the saying went, and the Colosseum was the epicenter of that principle. Power was not exercised solely from palace or forum. It was reinforced here, amid the roar of the crowd, the clamor for blood or mercy, the famed thumbs up or down, though that gesture, so iconic today, did not always mean what we think. The ultimate decision on a fallen gladiator's fate lay with the editor of the games, often the emperor himself. With a single motion, he determined whether the fallen body would live or die, a gesture that bore the full weight of Rome. And yet, it wasn't all violence. Between combats, the crowd enjoyed historical reenactments, mythological scenes, even aquatic shows in the early years, when the arena could still be flooded, and raffles with prizes. The Colosseum was a full-blown festival, a carnival of power, collective identity, and imperial pride. Game days stopped the city in its tracks, filling the air with excited murmurs and mingled scents of sweat, blood, and street food. Over time, the sacred nature of the games waned. Formulas grew stale. It became harder to find enough beasts or condemned men. Roman society changed. Christianity, abhorring blood sports, began to question these rituals. Christian emperors gradually banned the fights. By the 5th century, the Colosseum was but a shadow of itself, its structure imposing, its stands empty. Earthquakes, looting, neglect, and the repurposing of its stones for other buildings followed. Yet it never entirely vanished. For centuries it stood as ruin, quarry, refuge for the homeless. But it endured. And when the world rediscovered Rome, the Colosseum rose again as a symbol, not of bloodshed perhaps, but of imperial vision, engineering prowess, the art of mass control, the power to build for eternity. For in every block, in every arch, in every inscription worn away by time, lives the story of a people who, for centuries, turned the act of looking into a weapon, a custom, a spectacle that decided who was worthy to live and who was not. The last grandeur with the 5 good emperors. There was a moment along the long journey of the empire when Rome seemed to achieve a balance as delicate as it was powerful. A period in which administration ran like a well-oiled machine. The economy breathed steadily. The frontiers held firm. The people were well-fed. And the rulers were not figures fallen from the sky, but capable, measured men chosen for their merit and prepared for leadership. Nearly a century of an imperial throne passed not by blood, but by designation. This was the era of the so-called 5 good emperors, the final golden age of stability, of rational splendor, of power wielded with intelligence rather than fear. It all began with Nerva, an elderly senator elevated after the assassination of Emperor Domitian. His appointment was more an emergency remedy than a grand plan, a neutral choice acceptable to both Senate and army. Though he ruled for barely 2 years, his most important decision was revolutionary. He would not be succeeded by a biological heir, but by adoption. He chose a young Spanish general, respected by troops and commanders alike, Marcus Ulpius Trajan. In that single act, Nerva established a succession based on merit rather than blood, unknowingly setting in motion the greatest leadership cycle Rome would ever know. Trajan embodied the Roman ideal in its fullest expression: disciplined, brave, just, and austere. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent with the conquest of Dacia, modern Romania, and triumphant campaigns in the east. Yet his greatness did not rest solely on the battlefield. An able administrator, he reformed the grain dole for poor children, commissioned aqueducts, bridges, and roads, and left behind the spectacular Forum of Trajan, a civic center, marketplace, library, and piece of imperial propaganda crowned by the famous spiral column depicting his victory over the Dacians. So admired was his figure that Christian emperors would pray for centuries to be deemed better than Trajan, as if he were the ultimate standard. At his death, the throne passed to another exceptional man, Hadrian. Far from seeking fresh conquests, he recognized that the empire's vastness was a liability, and that true greatness came from consolidation. He toured nearly every province, not as conqueror, but as inspector, fortified frontiers, erected the famous wall in Britain bearing his name, reorganized the army, and established fairer rights for citizens while respecting local cultures. A lover of art, architecture, and Greek thought, his villa at Tivoli stands as a testament to contained power and beauty. Yet tragedy marked his reign. The death of his young lover Antinous plunged him into profound grief. Despite this, his legacy endured, a firmer, more organized, and more thoughtful empire. Next came Antoninus Pius, who ruled for 23 years without external wars or internal crises, an achievement that alone places him among the greatest. His style was discreet, almost invisible. No grand conquests, no sweeping campaigns. He focused on preserving what his predecessors had built: efficient government, fair justice, and constant respect for institutions. His nickname Pius reflects both his religious devotion and his reverence for his predecessor's memory. Under his steady hand, Rome enjoyed one of the most tranquil periods in its history, a calm that seemed almost impossible in a world accustomed to conflict. Finally, the reign of Marcus Aurelius began, the last of the five and perhaps the most complex. A Stoic philosopher and author of the Meditations, a work still widely read today for its profound insights, Marcus faced far tougher challenges than any before him. Conflicts flared on the northern frontiers with Germanic tribes, epidemics ravaged the population, and internal tensions reemerged. Yet he governed with integrity, a deep sense of duty, and dignified sorrow reflected in every line of his writings. He was not celebrated for brilliant victories, but for his resilience, ruling in hardship without turning tyrant or abandoning his principles. In his final act, however, Rome's delicate balance unraveled. Marcus, perhaps out of paternal love or fatal weakness, named his biological son Commodus his successor. With that decision, the cycle of merit-based adoptive emperors closed, and a new era of instability, mediocre or destructive rulers, and moral and political decline opened. What had been a summit began its slow slide toward crisis. Yet that brief, brilliant chapter of the five good emperors left an indelible mark. It demonstrated that the empire could be governed with moderation, long-term vision, and respect for the individual. That power need not rest solely on the sword, but on law, justice, and the power of reason. For almost a century, emperors ceased to be feared gods and became, for a moment, servants of the people, as every republic had dreamed in its earliest days. Perhaps it was a historical fluke, an improbable parenthesis amid centuries of violence. But while it lasted, Rome became more than a war machine. It became a civilization that governed itself with reason, not madness. That image, a mighty empire that might have been even greater if it had followed this path, continues to fascinate scholars today. The last true grandeur, the final beacon of hope. After them, history turned a new course, and although Rome remained powerful, it would never again shine with the same brilliance. The Century of Chaos. After the death of Marcus Aurelius and the disastrous reign of his son Commodus, Rome began to slip, slowly but inexorably, into unstable terrain from which it would not emerge unscathed. It was the dawn of a period that historians would rightly call the Century of Chaos. A full 100 years marked by civil wars, fleeting emperors, relentless invasions, economic collapse, plagues, provincial revolts, and a pervasive sense that the ordered world Rome once was unraveling before the very eyes of its inhabitants. Between Anno Domini 25 and Anno Domini 285, Rome was no longer the unbreakable power it had been, but a staggering colossus, battered from within and without. The freefall began with the civil war that erupted after Commodus's assassination. In the aftermath, emperors rose and fell at a bewildering pace. Pertinax tried to restore some semblance of order, but was killed by the Praetorian Guard. The throne was literally auctioned off to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus paid a king's ransom to the Praetorians to proclaim him emperor, while generals in the provinces rebelled at the galling spectacle. Septimius Severus, from Pannonia, marched on Rome, overthrew Julianus, and claimed the purple. His dynasty lasted longer, but it did nothing to cure the deeper ills. He militarized the state even more, drove up military spending, and opened the door to the idea that whoever commanded the legions could bend the entire empire to his will. In the decades that followed, the logic held. Generals became emperors, almost always proclaimed by their troops in some far-flung corner of the empire, and held power only as long as they could win battles and pay their soldiers. The emperor ceased to be an institution and became a position seized by force, a crown fought over with the sword. Between Anno Domini 235 and Anno Domini 285, more than 25 emperors came and went in barely 50 years. Most were murdered, fell in battle, or were executed by their own men. It was an era of perpetual uncertainty, where no one felt safe. Political maps shifted every few months, and the empire had no clear center, only multiple warring power bases. To this internal fragility were added ever more dangerous external threats. In the east, the resurgence of the Sasanian Empire replaced the old Parthian foe with an even more ambitious and aggressive adversary. The Sasanians captured Roman cities, even took Emperor Valerian prisoner, and publicly humiliated him, an unprecedented disgrace. In the north, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube with increasing frequency, exploiting weakened frontier defenses, sacking towns, settling on imperial lands, and eroding the very notion of a frontier. The empire no longer kept enemies outside its walls. It began to absorb them, willingly or not. Chaos spread to the economy as well. To fund the ballooning military expenses, coins were minted without restraint. Inflation exploded. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, became almost worthless. Trade contracted, roads fell into disrepair, and taxes grew unbearable for many farmers and artisans. Fiscal pressure forced millions to abandon their lands and seek refuge on the estates of wealthy landowners, giving rise, albeit in its infancy, to servile relations that would foreshadow medieval feudalism. Above all, the plague ravaged the empire. Epidemics struck repeatedly during this tragic century. The most devastating was probably the Cyprian plague in the mid-3rd century, which claimed thousands of lives each day in Rome and desolated vast regions of the empire. Populations declined, cities emptied, fear and superstition flourished. Traditional rituals seemed powerless, and many turned toward new, personal, hopeful forms of faith. Christianity, once an intermittently persecuted sect, began to spread among soldiers, slaves, and peasants, offering a narrative of redemption amid ruin. Perhaps most alarming was the empire's fragmentation, not at the hands of conquered peoples, but by military leaders who no longer felt part of a united whole. parallel structures emerged. The Gallic Empire in the west, with its own administration, army, and coinage. The Palmyrene Kingdom in the east, under Queen Zenobia, which openly defied Rome for years and came to control much of Asia Minor and Egypt. Rome was no longer one and indivisible. It was a patchwork of uncoordinated regions, each ruled by local strongmen who proclaimed themselves emperor, their only legitimacy the edge of a blade. And yet, amid this storm, figures rose who dared to restore order. The most remarkable was Aurelian, a soldier elevated to the throne when the empire teetered on collapse. He spent just a few years defeating the Gallic Empire, subduing Palmyra, securing the frontiers, and launching reforms to rebuild imperial authority. Known as the Restorer of the World, he was assassinated by his own officers. But his brief reign marked a turning point. He showed that Rome could still be thought of as a unified idea, not merely a battleground of competing territories. The century of chaos was also a period of profound transformation. The classical model of the empire, with a single center, a powerful senatorial elite, and a relatively decentralized administration, had ceased to work. The world had changed, and Rome, to survive, had to reinvent itself. That transformation would take shape soon after under Diocletian, who formally divided the empire, overhauled its fiscal and military structures, and laid the foundations of the late empire. But that is another chapter. For nearly 100 years, Rome was a wounded giant. It remained the benchmark, the dominant civilization, the goal of every political ambition in the West. But its body bore wounds that would not heal. The century of chaos was a brutal reminder that no order is eternal, that stability is fragile, that mismanaged power becomes a burden, and that even the mightiest civilization can falter when it loses faith in its own destiny. And though Rome survived, it was forever changed. The century of chaos had altered it in ways from which it would never fully recover. The Conversion of Constantine. In the midst of the chaos inherited from the century of turmoil, when the empire was only beginning to rebuild under new structures, a figure emerged destined to irreversibly change Rome's spiritual and political course. Constantine, son of the tetrarch Constantius, and born into an age of fragmentation and uncertainty, was not only a skilled military strategist and shrewd politician, but also the protagonist of one of the most impactful turns in Roman history: the empire's conversion to Christianity. His story cannot be understood without first grasping the context of the time. Rome was no longer ruled by a single emperor. In his attempt to impose order on chaos, Diocletian had divided power among 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, creating the Tetrarchy. But when its strongest members died, the balance shattered. Ambitions clashed anew. Among the many contenders for the throne, Constantine carved his path from Britain, where his father fell in campaign, up to the gates of Rome. His rise was neither inevitable nor slow. It was swift, determined, and cunning. His decisive moment would come in 312, when he faced his rival Maxentius on the outskirts of the capital, at the Milvian Bridge. That battle, yet another in the period's countless civil wars, would become legend, thanks to one detail that changed history. According to Christian sources, on the night before the combat, Constantine saw a sign in the sky, a luminous cross accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Moved by the vision, or perhaps seizing a potent political symbol, he ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Chi-Rho, the Greek letters Chi, H, and Rho, R, the initials of Christ's name. The next day, he was victorious. Maxentius perished in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome in triumph. He was proclaimed Emperor of the West, and with him, Christianity would emerge from the catacombs to ascend to the heart of power. It's unclear whether Constantine already considered himself a Christian at that moment. Probably not. His conversion was a gradual process, more political than spiritual at first. But from then on, he began openly protecting Christians, granting them privileges, drawing close to their leaders, and eventually weaving their faith into the official discourse of the empire. In 313, alongside his colleague Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, guaranteeing freedom of worship for all religions, including Christianity, which only recently had been persecuted in various provinces. This gesture was more than an administrative decree, it was a pivot. Until then, Roman religion had been essentially traditional, venerating ancient gods, intertwined with state functions, marked by public rituals and consecrated temples. Christianity offered something different, a faith of personal conviction, of sacred texts, of communities organized outside imperial oversight. Constantine saw not a threat in this new creed, but a tool. He understood he could consolidate his power by backing a growing movement, giving his empire a fresh ideological anchor, and, perhaps in time, becoming the guardian of a revealed truth. From that point forward, Christianity enjoyed increasing official support. Confiscated church properties were returned, clergy were exempted from certain taxes, new churches were permitted, and bishops assumed administrative roles. Although he wasn't baptized until the end of his life, Constantine already acted as a Christian emperor in everything but the sacrament, convening councils, settling doctrinal disputes, and funding ecclesiastical projects. He recognized that unity in this new faith was key to imperial stability, which is why he intervened when internal tensions flared. The most significant of these disputes was Arianism. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, taught that Christ was not eternal but created by God the Father, and thus inferior to him. This idea ignited a theological storm. To resolve it, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, the first great assembly of bishops from across the Christian world. There, with the emperor present, the Nicene Creed was drafted, affirming the equality of the Father and the Son and condemning Arianism as heresy. It was a landmark moment, the Roman state stepping in to define religious doctrine, not by persecution but through organization and legitimation. Yet Constantine's relationship with Christianity was neither simple nor linear. His reign still bore vestiges of old paganism. He continued to use solar symbols, retained traditional titles like Pontifex Maximus, and promoted a gradual transition. But the trend was unmistakable. Rome was no longer just a political entity. It was becoming a spiritual project. Toward the end of his life, he founded a new capital in the east, on the site of ancient Byzantium. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was conceived as a new Rome, more Christian, more strategic, more modern. Inaugurated in 330, it symbolized both the eastward shift of power and the empire's new identity. When he died in 337, Constantine requested baptism, following the custom of the time, leaving the sacrament for one's final purification. He passed away as a Christian emperor. With his death, the Roman world crossed a threshold never to be reversed. In the decades that followed, his successors continued the process. Theodosius, later in the century, would make Christianity the empire's official religion and outlaw pagan worship. Jupiter's temples, Vesta's hearth, ancestral rites would vanish one by one, replaced by churches, hymns, saints, and the cross. Constantine's conversion was not merely a personal choice. It was the dawn of a silent revolution. A transformation that reshaped architecture, culture, politics, and the very notions of power, life, and death. The emperor became not just a military leader or lawgiver, but a quasi-priestly figure, guardian of a faith that aspired to universality. From Constantine onward, the history of Rome cannot be told without Christianity. Two threads intertwined, influencing and redefining each other. The cross, once a symbol of the persecuted, became the standard of legions. Martyrdom, a cause for imperial veneration. And what began as a vision over the Tiber would go on to shape Western civilization for centuries. The division of the empire. For centuries, Rome had sustained the fiction of its unity with almost heroic stubbornness. From the hills of Latium to the farthest reaches of Hispania, from the banks of the Rhine to the desert of Syria, all were subjects of the same empire. All lived under the shadow of the same eagle, obeying, at least in theory, the laws of a single authority. But that image of cohesion, that one indivisible Rome, began to crack long before the emperors officially acknowledged it. The division was not a sudden act. It was the culmination of centuries of tension, of insurmountable geographic distances, of ever more localized political challenges. And when it finally materialized, it was not a rupture, but an adaptation, a practical, necessary measure that would forever change the face of the Roman world. As early as Diocletian's time, the idea of sharing power among multiple emperors had proven functional. Governing such a vast territory, with frontiers threatened on every flank, demanded presence, rapid response, and military coordination. The Tetrarchy, despite its internal conflicts, embodied this logic. An empire administered by 4 rulers, with divided competences but supposedly united in purpose. Yet this system could not withstand personal ambitions, the divided loyalties of the armies, and the weight of Roman traditions that still revolved around a single supreme emperor. When Constantine seized absolute power, he briefly restored imperial unity. But even he understood that the world's center had shifted. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer suitable as a capital, too distant from the frontiers, too exposed to senatorial infighting, too symbolic for a regime seeking renewal. So he founded Constantinople, not as just another city, but as a second Rome. Strategically placed between Europe and Asia on the shores of the Bosphorus, it soon became the administrative and cultural heart of the Eastern Empire. There, administration was sturdier, the economy more diversified, the cities more urbanized. The East had always been the empire's economic engine, and now it had a fitting capital. But the decisive moment came with Theodosius. He was the last emperor to rule the whole empire as a unit. Under his command, in the late 4th century, Christianity was reaffirmed as the official religion and pagan cults were actively suppressed. For the last time, the powers of East and West were concentrated in one man. Upon his death in 395 Anno Domini, the empire was divided between his 2 sons. Arcadius received the East, based in Constantinople. Honorius took the West, first in Milan and later in Ravenna. This division was both hereditary and functional. The Roman world was already split in practice, and this decision simply formalized an inevitable reality. From that moment on, the separation deepened. Each half developed its own priorities, its own style of governance, its own bureaucratic apparatus. The East, more urban, more Hellenized, with an elite versed in delicate cultural balances, found a measure of stability amid the turmoil. In contrast, the West, more rural, more dependent on the legions with a weakened agrarian economy, began a slow process of decay. Western emperors, often mere figureheads controlled by generals or the senatorial aristocracy, could not halt the advance of barbarian peoples pressing at the frontiers. That each half now had its own court, treasury, and army transformed what was initially an administrative division into a real one. The rhetoric of unity, of one Rome, persisted. But in practice, there were 2 distinct empires, sometimes cooperating, often competing, at times ignoring each other. The coinage differed, the laws began to diverge, and foreign relations followed separate paths. Culturally, the split had profound consequences. In the East, Greek solidified as the primary language. In the West, Latin held sway. The Christian Church, already establishing hierarchical structures, elevated its bishops to positions of growing political weight. The Bishop of Rome in the West began to build spiritual authority atop the crumbling edifice of political power. In the East, imperial authority maintained supremacy over the Church in a model that would later become fully Byzantine. This separation did not mean the immediate abandonment of the Roman ideal. For decades, both empires proclaimed themselves heirs to the same legacy. But reality outpaced rhetoric. The West became a machine that could not sustain itself. Gothic invasions, the fall of cities, loss of tax revenues, and institutional collapse drove it toward deeper fragmentation. Meanwhile, Constantinople strengthened its walls, organized its economy, welcomed scholars fleeing chaos, and prepared not only to be the new Rome, but its sole legitimate successor. The division of the empire was not a sudden tragedy, but an inevitable process, born of an empire too vast to govern, of cultural differences centuries in the making, of unresolved tensions between center and provinces. It was also an adaptation to a new world, more dangerous, more decentralized, more complex. Yet with that division, something was lost. The unifying power of Rome, the idea of a mother city for all peoples, began to dissolve. What remained were parts struggling to sustain an illusion. In the years that followed, history confirmed this course. The Western Empire formally fell in 476 Anno Domini, when its last emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain with scarcely a fight. The Eastern Empire, soon known as Byzantium, endured another 1,000 years. But it was no longer the same. It was something new, Roman in its roots, with inherited laws, institutions, and culture, yet possessing its own identity, its own dominant religion, its own language, and a transformed vision of the world. The division of the empire was, in a sense, the final admission that old Rome could no longer be one. By accepting that reality, it laid the groundwork for medieval Europe. The new Germanic kingdoms in the west, the Byzantine splendor in the east, and a Christian civilization that would be plural, conflictive, and forever marked by that great separation. The sackings that shook Rome. For centuries, the very idea that Rome, the eternal city, could be invaded, violated, desecrated, seemed unthinkable. Rome was the center of the world, the capital of the empire, the metropolis where everything began and ended. From its hills came laws spanning continents. From its temples arose prayers to gods who seemed to have eternally blessed its walls. Yet that prestige, built on conquests, monuments, and the blood of others, began to crumble when imperial order fractured. The sackings that shook Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries were not merely acts of war. They were symbolic blows, emotional ruptures, historic traumas marking the beginning of the end for the city's invulnerable image. The first major shock came in the year 410, when Roman legions could no longer hold the borders, and Western authority was slipping away. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, led his people to Rome's gates. This was no sudden assault. For years, the Visigoths had served as federated soldiers of the empire, driven south by Hunnic pressure. But broken promises, abuses, and the Roman aristocracy's scorn of these Arian Christians stoked tensions that finally exploded. Alaric besieged the city repeatedly, demanding land, rights, and political recognition. One truce after another collapsed, and when patience ran out and opportunity struck, the defenses gave way. On the 24th of August in the year 410, the Visigoths entered Rome. For 3 days they plundered it. It was not indiscriminate slaughter nor total destruction. Alaric had ordered that Christian temples be spared, but it delivered a profound shock. Monasteries were ransacked, noble homes looted, sacred objects carted off as booty. The world had changed. For the first time in 8 centuries, Rome fell to an enemy. That sack was more psychological than material. Rome was no longer the administrative capital. Its imperial seat had long since moved, but it remained the symbolic heart of the empire. News of the sacking spread like a wound throughout the Roman world. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, summed it up in anguished words. "The world has collapsed, and we watch." For an entire generation, it marked the end of an era, the sign that divine protection had abandoned the city, that past glories were now dust. The impact was so deep that even Christian thinkers, who for centuries had denounced Roman paganism, felt compelled to explain why God had allowed such desecration. In his monumental work, The City of God, Augustine of Hippo began to develop a theology of history in which the earthly Rome held no more value than any other city, and the true homeland of Christians was celestial. It was both comfort and rupture. Rome ceased to be the center and became a symbol, and when symbols fall, they leave deep cracks. The second great blow came just 45 years later. This time it was Genseric, king of the Vandals. Unlike Alaric, Genseric had no alliance with Rome nor any desire to integrate. His North African kingdom had become a maritime power dominating the Western Mediterranean. When talks with the Roman court, then based in Ravenna, broke down, Genseric sailed to Italy and landed unopposed. Rome, weakened and undefended, could not avert disaster. In the year 455, the Vandals entered the city. This time the sack lasted 14 days. It was not a massacre, but it was systematic and brutal. They carried off statues, imperial treasures, sacred ornaments, relics, and captives. Temples, palaces, and private houses were stripped bare. The term vandalism, coined centuries later for the deliberate destruction of cultural property, finds its origin in this very scene. Though the word may oversimplify the context, the memory of that sack remains etched in collective consciousness. Perhaps most revealing was the reaction of Pope Leo I, who, just as during the Visigothic sack, tried to negotiate with the invaders. Confronting Genseric, he averted a massacre and saved part of the city's spiritual heritage. Yet the gesture could not hide the reality. It was the Pope, not the Emperor, who brokered peace. Civil power lay in ruins. Rome, the city of consuls and Caesars, was now defended by a bishop. The Roman world was, before the eyes of its last witnesses, transforming into a medieval one. In the years that followed, Rome's prestige continued to decline. It was no longer a strategic prize, but a relic laden with history. And yet the sackings did not cease. At the end of the 5th century, King Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, without firing a shot. The symbol of Rome had been so emptied of substance that its fall met no resistance. Soon after, the Ostrogoths settled in Italy and turned Rome into just another city under their rule. The tragedy of these sackings lies not only in the physical destruction, but in what they undermined: the idea of Rome's invincibility, the notion of an eternal empire, the belief that Roman civilization represented humanity's highest order. What fell in those sackings were not merely columns, statues, or manuscripts. They shattered the confidence in a model that had given meaning to millions of lives. What remained was a diminished city, its population reduced, its aqueducts deteriorating, its monuments quarried for new buildings, its power increasingly concentrated in the church. And yet, Rome endured. Not as a political center, but as a religious symbol, as a pilgrimage site, as the seat of the Pope, as the spiritual heart of a world now called Christian, one that spoke different tongues, obeyed barbarian kings, and dreamt of vanished pasts. But the memory of those sackings, the wound of having been invaded, plundered, humiliated, beat on in its collective memory for centuries. That impact never faded. Every chronicle, every sermon, every treatise recalling those dark days did so with a mixture of rage and sorrow. And that memory shaped the way all of medieval Europe understood power. Rome, the fall of Rome. The sackings of Rome became warning, myth, symbol of fragility. Because when the giant fell, the world realized that no power, however mighty, is eternal. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. The end of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a sudden crash, nor a catastrophic event that ripped history apart overnight. Rather, it was a long march toward collapse, a slow decomposition in which institutions ceased to function. The army grew distant, the economy unraveled, and cities emptied while the countryside fragmented under new lords. Unlike the epic tales that marked Rome's rise and expansion, its decline was a gradual loss of purpose, a prolonged disillusionment, like a candle flickering out on its own in the dark. The story of this fall doesn't begin in the year 476, as often repeated, but much earlier. From the 3rd century onward, the Western Empire had already begun to stagger. Constant civil wars, dynastic struggles for the throne, border invasions, the collapse of Mediterranean trade, unbearable taxes, and the desertion of the peasantry all weakened the very pillars upon which Rome had been built. The Tetrarchy was a desperate attempt to reorder power, but it merely postponed the inevitable. By the 5th century, with the empire irrevocably split between East and West, the western half was in dire straits. The army, once disciplined and proud, was increasingly staffed by Germanic mercenaries. Emperors no longer rose through proven political careers, but through court intrigues, military pressure, or foreign imposition. Ravenna, the capital from which Italy was ruled, reflected this decay. A marsh-guarded city, distant from Rome, ever more isolated from reality. The figure who most vividly embodies the end is the young Romulus Augustulus, a name that rings with cruel irony. Romulus, like the mythical founder of the city; Augustulus, the diminutive of Augustus, Rome's first great emperor. But this Romulus was neither warrior nor statesman. Barely a teenager, he was placed on the throne by his father, the general Orestes, in a last-ditch effort to hold together an empire already in ruins. His reign was brief, almost symbolic. He ruled over an empty shell, no resources, no real authority, no standing army. Imperial legitimacy had vanished, leaving only the husk of an idea. In 476, Odoacer, leader of the Heruli, one of many Germanic peoples who had served as Roman auxiliaries, deposed Romulus Augustulus without resistance. There was no grand battle, no massacre. The young emperor was simply removed and sent to a villa in Campania with a modest pension. Imperial dignity was conveyed to the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, with a clear message: no emperor was needed in the West. Odoacer proclaimed himself King of Italy, ruling in the name of the Eastern Empire but with full autonomy. Thus, in fact, the line of Western Roman emperors came to an end. Remarkably, this moment, later so dramatized by history, was met at the time with a mixture of resignation and relief. There were no mass laments, no widespread protests, no clamor to restore Rome's former glory. For Rome was no longer what it had been. Its institutions were corroded, its economy shattered, its roads unsafe. People had learned to live under the local power of bishops, rural nobles, or barbarian chieftains. What fell was the imperial title, not the daily life of a society long adapted to chaos. Yet the symbolic weight of that fall was immense. With it closed an era. The empire that had conquered the known world, erecting cities, aqueducts, laws, theaters, and temples, ceased to exist as a political unit in the West. What followed was something entirely new: a fragmented, rural Europe, ruled by nascent kingdoms blending Roman customs with Germanic traditions, and overseen by a church that became the sole stable power, spiritual heir to a vanished Rome. The transition was far from clean. For decades, new kingdoms, of the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, sought in their own way to present themselves as Rome's legitimate successors. They used Roman laws, Roman titles, and Latin-derived tongues. Even the concept of empire survived first in ecclesiastical discourse and later in Charlemagne's coronation, centuries on. But that continuity was more illusion than reality. The imperial machinery lay in ruins. Taxes went uncollected. The regular army had vanished. Imperial coinage ceased to circulate. the Roman world no longer existed. The deepest consequence of this fall was not the loss of political power, but a transformation of mindset. Roman times had been urban, organized, centralized, defined by a clear sense of citizenship, public duty, and belonging to a greater order. Post-Roman times were about survival, local loyalties, closed economies, and constant violence. The Middle Ages were no sudden catastrophe, but a radical rupture. Classical knowledge retreated to monasteries, cities shrank, trade routes closed, and the Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, became a frontier between warring worlds. And yet Rome never fully disappeared. Its language lived on as the Romance tongues. Its laws were copied, adapted, and rescued centuries later. Its ruins fueled medieval Renaissance and modern imaginations. Its shadow fell over popes, Holy Roman emperors, absolutist monarchs, and Enlightenment revolutionaries. Rome did fall, yes, but its fall was not oblivion. It was transformation. Myth, model, warning. The end of the Western Roman Empire was far more than a military collapse. It marked the close of a civilization that had endured over a millennium, defined the boundaries of the known world, and produced a culture unmatched in architecture, law, philosophy, urban planning, religion, and art. Its disappearance ushered in a new, uncertain, harsher, fragmented age. But it also left a legacy so vast that in its fall, Rome achieved immortality. And that's it for our journey through the history of Rome. If it captivated you as much as it did me to tell it, I invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments. Which part of this story impacted you the most? Subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming episodes, which will continue exploring the unexpected twists of the past. Thank you for being here. Good night.